My guest today is Axel Bernabe, a partner at the law firm of Hudson Russ. Axel served as chief legal counsel for health for New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo, where he inherited a small, underfunded medical marijuana program. He grew it, expanded into hemp and CBD regulation, then became the administration's point person for drafting what became the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, the law that legalized adult use cannabis in New York. When the law passed and a new agency needed to be built, he stayed to help build it, serving as the Office of Cannabis Management's first chief of staff and senior policy director. He left in September of 2023, the day that final adult use regulations were formally adopted. He has not spoken since publicly about the program until now. Now is critically important as the agency will be holding stakeholder and general public meetings around the state during the month of April. Please check the OCM website for more information on those dates and locations. Welcome, Axel. Great to see you.
It's great to be on, Herb. It's been a while. It's very nice to be chatting with you again.
Well,
Congratulations on your podcast. It's quite a success.
thank you, thank you. And the first time that we had a virtual meeting, if you remember, was an interview where you were interviewing me for a position at the OCM.
That would have been, yeah, in and around January of, 2022, I'd say.
No, it was actually, it was, I remember it was September 2020, September 2021.
Oh my
Because then
gosh.
then
Yeah,
the office kicked off December of 2021.
that's right. We started doing our hiring as early as we could.
Right. So now 5 years have passed since the MRTA was signed into law. 2.5 years have passed since New York's adult use cannabis regulations became final. The market is real now. Licenses have been issued, stores have opened, operators are in business, and anyone paying attention can see where the rules are working, where they have created unintended friction, and where they simply did not go far enough. OCM's upcoming listening tour sends a signal that as the market matures, they recognize there's a need to revisit the regulations, not to do a complete overhaul, but hopefully to adjust and fine tune, and that's a good thing. I thought there was no one better to have this conversation with than the person who led the teams that drafted that regulatory structure. How does that sound, Axel?
That's fantastic. That's spot on. Definitely not a regulatory overhaul. Definitely the engine analogy for sure. So that works.
All right. So let's start at the beginning. New York wasn't the first state to legalize adult use cannabis. I think we were the 15th state. So what was New York trying to do differently? What was the focus in New York?
Well, that takes us back quite a while, and there are a lot of interviews we all gave at the time trying to operationalize the mandate that the legislature had given us. So it was different than what a lot of states had done previously in that we were really looking to emphasize two parallel and kind of two main policy goals that supplement each other. And that's the public health goal of making sure that that this is still a kind of regulated space for cannabis, and then the equity and reinvestment in communities that have been disproportionately impacted. So that was the biggest. We'd learned a lot from the West Coast states. We went on tours. We spoke with every other regulator. We had already established a national regulators association. So we had a lot of information and a lot of learned experience, and that was the bit of the innovation. So there were a couple of things that we did differently to try to implement that, which I know we'll be talking about. But that was the biggest change that we tried to implement.
So now the word equity is all over the MRTA. You know, equity means different things to different people. What did it mean to you when you were drafting the law, and how did you try to build that into the regulatory structure?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are a lot of ways to peel that. There's just the impetus and the importance that criminal justice reform had with the legalization effort. You know, unfortunately, we had the honor of being one of the most aggressive states when it came to criminalization of cannabis and incarceration rates and other forms of harm. But you know, in the context of what we're discussing today, I think the most relevant, now that we have a market that's up and running and we have operators, the idea was to create a level playing field as much as possible so that folks that had traditionally not been able to access the legal markets or access capital historically and had been harmed by the war on drugs would have had at least the same opportunity, if not
Hmm.
better, to launch. And then it was a very competitive market. I think, as people will agree, New York is a very competitive market. And it was really about them being able to compete fairly. And so that was something we spent a lot of time working on. And as you know, rolled out a lot of programs. I mean, you were there for them as I was early on.
Well, I mean, it's interesting what you just said because I recently had the acting executive director, John Kagia, on the podcast, and he said exactly the same thing. So it's really interesting, to hear that consistent message. It was level playing field, and it was how competitive New York can be, and and really that you weren't picking winners and losers, but that making sure that people were, had that opportunity and an equal opportunities to succeed.
That's right. That's exactly right. There were incentives like incubators and the DASNY sites. There were other wraparound services that were meant to try to charge up and facilitate entry by folks that would have had a hard time normally getting into a market like this. But fundamentally, it was about giving people licenses that had justice involvement or justice involved previously, and trying to assist with some loans or with access to credit, or limiting the sort of number of licenses early so that they would be able to have access to investors. So there were a lot of very specific programmatic implementations, but overall the mission was that. And I think, we can talk about the speed to market. For sure, there were delays, the DASNY, there's been a lot of discussion about that. But in terms of looking at the market now, after 5 years, I think we have an interesting market relative to other markets, comparable markets like Florida. You couldn't have two more different markets in terms of that.
Right. Now, New York's market is described as a two-tier system modeled on the alcohol regulation. Can you just quickly explain what that means and why a two-tier system matters?
Yeah, sure. So that was another mandate we got from the legislature, and they were very clear that that was a structural aspect to the market that was going to help us implement both those goals, the public health goal and the equity goal. So a two-tier market is essentially modeled after the alcohol beverage control law, so the alcohol sector, where a supplier in the market cannot also own retail. So it's broken up between a cultivator, processor, and distributor on one side, and then the sort of retail, delivery, and on-site consumptions, restaurants and bars on the other. And that sort of does two things. One, it limits the ability of large vertical companies that can grab market share. So Florida is a perfect example. Very limited number of players, all of them with their own stores, all competing. So large players competing against one another, versus us having a tier, a retail tier in particular, that we were looking to protect and keep as a small business tier. And that helped also with equity, because small businesses are obviously easier to run by folks that don't traditionally have access to capital. And so that informs a lot of what we did in New York. Washington State had that model, and a lot of Canadian provinces have that model, but otherwise it's fairly unique in cannabis in the States, in the US.
Are you aware that, prior to alcohol prohibition, that there were, this concept of tied houses where the brewers also owned the bars and saloons, and, there were bars and saloons on almost every corner because it was the brewers just opened it up and only sold their own products. So it's interesting because after prohibition, that's probably why the ABC laws broke up that model.
That's exactly right. And that's what we researched pretty extensively when we implemented it. So you'll see a lot of parallels, and we can talk about the market structure and where we change things. So for example, in alcohol, you can only have one liquor store, but in cannabis, we realized that one liquor store didn't give you enough purchasing power and enough ability to negotiate with distributors. And so we allow folks to have 3 dispensaries. And also, because of the capital constraints, we allow folks to be passive investors in more than 3. And those had certain rules that we need to discuss now, I think, as part of this modernization or revision to see how the regs were played out on the ground. That's absolutely key now.
So, going back, you left the agency in September 2023, the same day again as the final regulations were adopted. And now you spent 2.5 years working in the industry. So what's the biggest difference between how those rules looked on paper and how they're playing out in the real world?
Yeah, so that's a really macro question, but maybe I can frame it and then we can jump in with some examples. I ended up spending a lot more time in government than I'd anticipated because COVID
Didn't we
happened.
all?
Yeah, exactly. Didn't we all? So 8.5 years later, When I told my wife it'd be 3 years, we spoke about it at the office, and we decided that a good time for exit would be when we, in fact, issued the regulations, because that's a really good milestone, sets the framework. So when the regulations were obviously instrumental, there are hundreds of pages of regulations, and they really start to implement the vision that the legislature gave us according to these policy objectives that you and I discussed. And so, when you go through the exercise of drafting regulations, you don't know everything right away. You have the old, you have preceding states that give you some information on what to do. You have your mandate from the legislature, but you have a lot that you need to implement in the regulations. And so the way we approached it was, we have to cover the whole ground, and we have to focus on what's important. But we also knew that the market would evolve, and we didn't have a full window on what it would look like in practice. So you'll see regulations. Some of the regulations remain fairly general in their prohibition or in their authorizations, and leave room for some interpretation or subsequent regulatory clarification. We used a lot of guidance when we issued these, because guidance is more flexible. We got in some trouble for using guidance, but we were also looking to move fast. Everybody wanted this program to get up and running, and so we issued the regulations. In hindsight now, it's not even hindsight. It's essentially, I think the best analogy is when you get a new car and you have a new engine. You're not supposed to run it too hot, and after 600 miles or so, you're supposed to go in and get a tune-up. You're changing the oil, you're tightening the belt, you're doing a lot of significant timing assessments and tweaks, but it's not an overhaul. So, but it's absolutely kind of contemplated. We had contemplated it, and we didn't have every single thing figured out. And nor did we want to be excessively prescriptive without knowing how the market was going to adapt or respond. So that's kind of how I feel, where I feel we are. And I think that's why it's so important what the OCM is doing. And the reason, when we talked about it, you said, why don't you come on and talk about some of these issues? I thought it could be helpful, because I'm just trying to frame the issues so that the OCM can receive comments that they will then decide on, that are the most informed possible, and focus on issues that I think we thought were important, remain important, but we, the office needs as much assistance as possible to get it right, as much feedback from stakeholders. So that's kind of what we talked about doing on this show. I think we're good people to do it because of our history and our insight on the broader policy goals, but this isn't about pushing an agenda. It's about teasing policy issues, explaining where we had stopped, and what the options are for clarification or going forward.
Could you go back, and for people who don't know, what the process is like, right? Or if you work in government, you go to an agency and the law has been there forever, the regulations have been there forever, all right? There's all kinds of practice and history to how things are interpreted. Could you just, if you can, quickly just sort of describe you're starting from a blank slate, really, right? There's a whiteboard with nothing on it. There's a laptop with nothing on it, and teams have to be put together. So can you just sort of describe what that process was like?
Yeah, it's a startup. It's a massive startup, but you're not just building one product. You're not just building one brand, or even a cannabis product or a widget. You're essentially trying to build the rules of the road for an entire industry. And so the regulations are extremely expansive. They're very broad. And like you said, we're doing things differently than in alcohol. We're borrowing from alcohol, but we don't have precedent. We don't have history. This is a new law that's handed to the agency from the legislature. That's also why we created a new office, because other states had told us they had put it in the Department of Health, in the Department of Agriculture, in the Department of Financial Services, and that fragmentation made it really difficult to build the expertise. So the office was an essential part of that process of consolidating knowledge and experience and building that. So over the last 5 years, that has started to stabilize. People are knowledgeable. People have a track history. But for the first several years, you don't have that. And so usually regulatory changes are for rules that have been in place for 70, 80, 90 years in the case of the State Liquor Authority, for example. And so you're making very modest tweaks. Every time you change anything in a regulation, there are stakeholders that have very entrenched interests that come in and push and lobby. We had to come up with solutions without the benefit of that history. And so there were a lot of decisions being made a lot of the time. As you know, I mean, our office was essentially a think tank startup center where we had to model out all sorts of potential economic realities and anticipate how the market would act and try to put in guidelines and road signs that we thought would work. It was amazing, but it was a challenge for sure.
Anticipate how humans would act, right? Not just, how corporations would act, how investors would act. So
Absolutely.
fascinating time. So can you just sort of, give us sort of a landscape of what we're going to be talking about today? What are some of the issues we're going to cover?
Yeah. So when you reached out and you were saying, so they put out the listening sessions and they're saying, okay, per their own sort of mandate, they're like, look, we need to understand what's been working, understand what's been a little bit more complicated. And as you were asking me about that, I started to rhyme off a bunch of things that I've been seeing. And you're like, look, we should tee these up and have other people weigh in on them. So there's a lot here and it gets pretty technical. Unfortunately, we've been talking in generalities, but the regulations are very specific and very prescriptive. And I think the ones we want to focus on, or the ones I've been focusing on, is working with people in the industry that are operators or ancillary businesses to operators that are actively involved in the economics. So we're really talking about narrowly focusing this on law and economics and the part of the regulations that govern the business, not as much, the reinvestment fund, which is a whole very interesting
Mhm.
topic that people should be paying attention to. We have real revenue coming in now from the taxation. So we're not talking about criminal justice reform and how we were doing on that and expungement, all those issues. We're really talking about economics. So, when I left, I went back to private practice and I've been doing healthcare work, which I do. And but I've gotten a lot of calls from cannabis operators, and people were asking me to interpret the regulations and say, look, I get it. I see what it says. But now that you get to this point, and we'll talk about a couple issues: sole control, passive investors, card rights, all these things, there's not enough meat on these bones. Like, what did you guys mean when you said this or that? Because there isn't enough specificity. And so this goes back to what we were saying before. We didn't flesh out everything. We went as far as we could with the time we had, with the knowledge that the industry would mature. So I've spent, 2 years, 2.5 years now, really working with people and working through these issues. And it's shed so much light on how the industry has responded and interacted with the regulations we have. And it's been a really, really huge learning experience, the kind of experience I didn't have when I was inside. And that has really highlighted some of the uncertainty, I'd say, that the industry needs. And it doesn't have to be a solution that's one way or another necessarily. It just has to be greater certainty. Businesses like to know what the rules are so that they can operate as close to the border of those rules. But when you have some gray zones, it makes it harder for them to make economic decisions. So when we discussed this, I thought we could talk about three large buckets, three sets of rules. The first one deals with questions of economics around control, sole control, passive investors, change of ownership, controlling more than one license or three licenses in the retail space. Those are all sort of control related issues. And we could kind of dig into those. I think those are helpful. The other one we talked about were more related to the administration, things that impact the supply chain and the market rules a little bit more broadly. And the two issues I thought we could talk about there are distribution issues that I've noticed and testing issues that I've noticed. So those are really big questions that I think a lot of people in the industry have. And then I think we could sort of end with more infrastructure and administration issues, as we called them, which is discussing the CARD program, the Conditional Adult Use Retail Dispensary Program, and where it is now, and some of the sort of leases, proximity protection,
Right.
and also kind of receivership. So there's a lot there, a lot of economic concepts. But I'd love to the extent that the time permits, to give you sort of the two sides or more of each debate, and kind of go through some of these if it interests listeners as they prepare for those.
Absolutely, and I think no matter how long we go, we could go longer because I think we're only going to be able to touch on some of these issues. So we begin. So New York requires social equity and card licensees to have sole control, which sounds like like an obvious thing, sole control. But what does it really mean to have sole control of a license, and how do you balance that requirement, which is intended as protection for the licensee? So how do you balance that against the need to attract investors? And how is this practice different in other types of businesses?
Yeah, so it's a good framing one. This comes back again to the mission we had. Soul control was a concept that we developed, which was meant to at first protect the social equity licenses or the card
Mhm.
licenses because we had noticed that in a lot of markets, as you roll out licenses and they're a little scarce, people come in, investors come in and they try to buy the license and people flip the license. Or investors come in and implement a lot of very complicated loan documents or investment documents that can be predatory, and then the borrower doesn't understand necessarily the complexity of that investment, needs the money to open, and signs documents that are a little problematic. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand what the parameters were, balancing those two things. So on the one end, making sure that the people that got the license remain in control of the license, and on the other hand, making sure that they were able to cede enough control to have investors and lenders be comfortable enough to invest, right? Because if you come in and lend $500,000 to a dispensary for them to start up, and you say, I see what your business is, I like what you're doing, I'm going to lend you $500,000, but here are a couple of covenants, here are a couple of provisions in the loan agreement, including, you can't sell the business without paying me back, right? You can't sell the business without me first getting paid back. You can't go out and borrow another $5 million on better terms or on better repayment terms or putting them as a first priority, without me either agreeing or getting paid back. So that's an example. Well, who controls the business if I can't sell the business without getting approval from my lender, right? Or similarly, you had a lot of investors that came in and said, okay, I want to get in, I'll take a minority share of the company, 20, 30, 40%, and I'll invest $1 million. We'll do this together. You run the store, but I'm now an investor. In that situation, typically an operating agreement between two business partners like that would have basic negative covenants. What those are protections for minority investors. So again, same idea. And it doesn't have to be big investors. It can be your buddy who's coming in and putting significant sweat equity into this and saying, I'm going to work around the clock. I'll be there at the store with you. But if you let in new members, so there's a handful, for example, that are the typical ones that you would see in any corporate law operating agreement. If you let in a new member, there's a supermajority vote. Like both of us have to agree. Not I get to call it, but both of us have to agree. Right. Or if we sell the company, both have to agree. Or if we're going to go into default or bankruptcy.
And not necessarily predatory. It's just, I'm not going to invest if I don't have some protection on my money.
Exactly. We're sort of in this together. And, there's actually a really interesting, and I've been looking online for an analogy, because when we were all discussing this internally, we were sitting there, the card program, as an example on sole control, requires that the justice-involved individual maintain 51% of the equity of a business, 51% of the profit of a business. And there we were like, well, is someone going to invest if they put in most of the money and they get less of the equity, fine, but then they want repayment earlier. Like they say, okay, well, first you repay me what I loaned, and then we split it equally, or we split it, 60-40 for you. But that's not allowed, right? You're only supposed to get 49% back, so you have to structure your deal like that. That's okay, but we were very aware that that not allowing the justice-involved individual to dilute below 51% was going to be risky for investors coming in, because they were going to want to get some of their loan back before too long in order to then, share the profit after the loan had been repaid. So we were always toying with that dilution threshold. That was one big thing. And then what we didn't do, so this is the key, what we didn't do is we didn't talk about the minority rights protection. So we didn't get very specific. We just left it. There's a proposition, if you look at the sole control definition, we left it. It was subsection 5, and where we said, look, the bottom rule is no one can have more power than the justice-involved individual. So if you and I are creating a business together, Herb, I can't appoint directors without you. I can't make decisions without you. But there are things we can do together. As long as no one has more power, then I can't have more power than you if you're the justice-involved individuals. That's where we drew the line. And so that leaves room for, okay, what can we agree to collectively? What can we do collectively? And we never spelt that out, because that's a lot of detail in the regulation, even more detail. But I think it's time to ask ourselves that questions, because businesses are structured. I've seen dozens and dozens of operating agreements, right? I get calls from owners and investors and lenders every day. And they all ask, what's the line? What's the bright line? What can I do? What can't I do? So just on this particular issue, what I found really helpful is this analogy with the Small Business Administration at the federal level. So they have a program that they lend to small businesses, but they're supposed to only lend to small businesses. So what happens if you have a big business that's a parent to a small business? And it kind of controls the small business, but it's a little bit independent. They had to develop rules to say, when does it stop being a small business? And interestingly, they use the same kind of control questions that we do. And they clearly articulated and said, look, for the purposes of determining if the small business is independent and is not being controlled by a larger investor or parent, we will not count as a form of control if you have basic minority right protections like supermajority voting for these 4 or 5 things that I was mentioning. Change of the operating agreement, new members, bankruptcy, large new borrowing, sale of the business. Those are all, and we should make that clear because it just isn't. I mean, look, again, we can have a debate on this. I'm just saying that this is the kind of stuff that I hadn't thought of. We didn't really have that level of visibility, but really at this point, with the fine tuning of that engine, we could probably use a little oil change on that.
And this only applies to social equity and card licensees, correct?
That's correct. But that makes up, as we know, thankfully, that makes up over 50% of the market. And so it affects a lot of licensees. Right. And then it's not only
does it disadvantage those very same social equity and card licensees when you're trying to create a level playing field?
Well, so I had put that in bucket sort of 3 because that's a really tricky question related to the cards in particular, and so I want to kind of come back to that a little bit. It's got a little bit more policy and a little bit more politics that's more delicate. But from a real, and again, when we talked, we said we'd get pretty in the weeds on this. From a real regulatory analysis of provisions that could use more meat on the bone, you have sole control, and a corollary which ties into this, because you said this is social equity licenses. There's the passive investor,
right. And that's the next issue. So can you describe what is a passive investor? What can they do? What can they not do? And how do you cross the line?
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, that's right. I mean, it's the next issue, but it's intimately related. So, So where this came from was we wanted individuals to have sole control. We wanted it to be a small business driven sort of market. Mm-hmm. But we noticed that the retail tier, first of all, was cannabis, so there was not a lot of capital relative to sort of alcohol, and we'd noticed that in alcohol you had one mom and pop wine store, but you couldn't have a couple wine stores, so you put it in your uncle's name and your cousin's name, and it was very difficult for these businesses to scale and to do more interesting work, especially in a large market like New York. So we gave everybody 3 retail dispensaries. That was the same thing. And then we said, and investors and landlords and others, and even licensees, like even a retail owner, can be a passive investor in more than 3 retail dispensaries. So you can have up to 20% of the equity of another business without you being in control of that business. And that's permissible. Same thing on the supply side, and this is actually where a lot of it's happening too, which is you're supposed to have 1 cultivation license. You're not supposed to control more than 1. That limits how much canopy you can grow, as we know. It limits the number of licenses that are out there, but you can become a passive investor in more than 1 license, take 20% of the equity. So the question, we left it at that. That sounds great in theory, and I think the concept is still very, very good. That's why we have, I think John talked about it, a balanced supply chain. We have a nice sort of even growth. We don't have market price compression like a lot of other states have experienced. So nice and steady is working, but we never defined what level of involvement that passive investor could have. So I could paint 2 scenarios. One is, here's some money, or Herb, I'm going to lend you money and take 20% of the equity. Call me when you're done. And the other is, I want to see what's happening on the other extreme. I want to be a director in your company. That's not very passive if I'm sitting there and I'm calling the shots. Mm-hmm. But in between there, what if you ask me my advice? I'm an investor and I know whatever, I'm a consultant, or I have, certain, again, agreements on the sole control side. So they're very intertwined. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, because a lot of that is happening right now in the industry because it's growing frantically. People are partnering, people are working with these agreements, and there's not a lot of clarity. And lack of clarity makes it risky for these businesses. That's how I think about it.
But when does it cross the line? Besides
Yeah, so Well, I have an opinion on where it should, and actually, I have clients. I have a lot of clients on one side that believe that folks should be able to invest and participate, even if they're not controlling the day to day, in a more active way because they have a lot of insight and they have a lot of experience, and or maybe investing in multiple locations, multiple dispensaries, or multiple farms. But then on the other hand, I have clients that are much more concerned about what they're seeing. They're a solo dispensary and they're seeing other dispensaries kind of aggregating or having brand licensing agreements, which is a very hot topic, right? Which we can talk about, or supply side agreements where farmers are coming together and sharing and pooling resources. So, I'm going to answer the question a little bit more by using those two examples, but I want to introduce a third concept, which kind of ties in, if I can. That's the concept of financial and controlling interest, which is a different provision in the regs. Do you mind if I do that? I know it's a lot for us to juggle.
Go ahead.
Okay. So because these three concepts are really tied together. And again, I know this sounds really academic, but if you're in the business, if you're an operator, this is what you're thinking about day in and day out as you're trying to expand. So extraordinarily important for the market going forward. So we had two sets of prohibitions. As we were discussing, the passive investor and the sole control deal with internal controls as to who owns the company. So you and I are partners. We create a dispensary. What can we agree to together? What can we not agree to? If you're justice involved, what do you have to retain as certain exclusive rights? The second prohibition, and I think there's been some confusion, frankly, in the market about whether these things are related. They're not. The second one is called controlling financial or controlling interest. It's a separate provision. And that provision deals with, okay, if I'm a dispensary, or let's say a farmer, I'm a farmer and I have my license and I invest, so passive control, or I lend money to, or I partner with another license. At what point does that become financial or controlling interest? So, right. So I know that if I take more than 20% equity, I immediately become a TPI. We know what TPIs are. And that means I'm now a TPI. I can't be a TPI more than two cultivators. So that immediately becomes a financial or controlling interest. But there are other much grayer zones of people working together. So this isn't about internally, is there a social equity applicant and are they doing their own thing? It's much more about, are you controlling more than one license? So let's talk about cultivation. We came early on, we wanted to issue licenses as fairly as possible. We issued them, as you remember, we had this whole debate internally about giving them to hemp growers. First, we issued about 400, a little under, and everybody got an acre outdoor. And it's great. And that was a level playing field. And everybody started there and they started to do well. And then there are people that grew and that have great brands. And most of our growers are still New Yorkers, which is fantastic. The more, every time I get a call, you hear a story about a farmer or someone who was in the hemp space who grew, a THC and developed a really cool brand or wants to sell their license now and they want to capitalize that and get out. So it was small and it was an acre. And so what happened is, there aren't very many efficiencies of scale there. So what farmers have done, and we allowed them to do early on, is grow on the same land. So I'm farmer A and you're farmer B, and you say, Axel, can I come grow on your land? And so I give you a lease, and then you come on and you grow, and then we say, let's share inputs. So we say, let's go buy medium together. Let's go buy starts together. So we do that. We pool that money together. Every day I come in, you come in, and we're both growing on our land and we're exchanging ideas. Then we harvest and we need to process. Well, are we each going to process, or are we each going to harvest and, seasonal labor and hire separate seasonal labor? What if we, aggregate that? And then we go to processing and curing. And can we aggregate that? Now we're starting to be closer to a joint venture. Are we going to be accused, you of controlling my license and me of controlling your license? We created this collective license, which was supposed to be, these sort of co-ops, but they're very difficult to administer. We haven't issued the licenses out of the OCM because they're complicated. And so right now, the reality, Herb, is that on the supply side, everybody's trying to partner in order to scale. Everybody needs more inputs, more biomass. Everybody's developing brands. So there's a lot of gray there. And we really need some greater clarity on where to draw the line. So, I don't know if that's too much, but that's really kind of ties the bow together on what's cooperation, what's market consolidation related to those three concepts that we've been sort of discussing.
So, one of the things that we wanted to make sure is that, we didn't want to force people to stay in the industry if they didn't want to, right? So we did sort of create a process for the transfer of that majority ownership. But that process has stalled at the OCM. So what's the impact of this backlog at OCM?
Yeah, so that's one of the ones, the sort of administrative structural issues. But I think this is a good place to put it in, Herb. You're right. So I would, I'll definitely take personal some responsibility on this. We talked about how ownership changes were to happen. What I don't think we had anticipated was just the extent, the volume of ownership change requests, licensing, processing requests that the office would need to go to. I mean, in all fairness, and actually, this is one of the sort of quick aside that I wanted to say at the very beginning. I think one of the things we really need to reiterate, all of us as stakeholders that are on the outside right now, is that the OCM needs more resources. You and I have been saying this from the beginning, and we even went as far as saying there should be two buckets. There's the steady state. You remember we were planning. You're the director of operations at the time. We were saying, okay, I was asking you, Herb, what do we need in terms of resources? And you said, well, there's going to be a spike. The first 2,000 licenses, we need twice as many people. And then afterwards, we just need enough people to process those changes. So we were thinking about contract folks, not full-time pension folks, and having kind of two buckets. That unfortunately wasn't realized as much as I think it should have been. So there's just a constant resource constraint that will get better as we get over this hump. But right now the hump is massive. So that directly informs what happened. Out of the gate, we had the cards. We had we had the AUCCs on the supply side.
That's the cultivators, the first cultivators.
That's right. Yeah. We had we had the provisionals. We had all the different license types, and our licensing department, as you know, because you were getting all the calls and the complaints about not being able to process that level of volume, those are still not done. We are still processing those queues as fast as possible. And yet what we didn't realize, in a way, I guess maybe we should have, is that once you start releasing these licenses, people are going to want to sell some of them. They're going to want to trade or even dilute themselves beyond 51%. They want to keep it, but they've got investors. They want to scale. And they're like, as a founder in a small business, keeping 20, 30% of my equity is amazing, right? It's not giving up your company. Founders give up equity to investors all the time. So what it created is a huge surge of requests for changes in ownership, which the office could just not process. And so they issued guidance that said, look, the office can approve up to 49%, but 51% requires board approval. So that guidance came out. It's very specific and technical. And so that was a year and a half. That was in August of 2004, I believe. So it was a while ago. And the problem is that then everybody, including myself, had to structure corporate deals around this, where you would buy part of the company now and you buy part of the company later, but you had to maintain control during the duration. And everybody thought this was a temporary solution or temporary problem, and that the office would be approving these. At this point, it has created a huge market distortion. You have all these businesses that are waiting. Some of them are looking to sell entirely. The original owners are still involved because they have to be until the board clears them. There is no end in sight. The new owners are getting tired of investing in a company that they still have this person hanging out on. And now there's tax liability for companies that aren't paying taxes. Now there's disputes. Now there's trying to unwind these. And so that inability to transfer 51, which is completely legal under the regulations, is creating a huge drag and a huge set of complexities that I think is going to bite everybody in the butt. So I think we need solutions on that one. I don't have, I'm not in a position to be proposing administrative solutions anymore, but there are various solutions, like more guidance that allows the board to approve them in bulk and then reserves the right to make sure that they were properly reviewed, or takes ones where the minority owner that bought in is also already a TPI somewhere else and is legally allowed to take the full, therefore they've already been vetted. Maybe there's a way to do that. I don't have solutions, but I do think that this is an issue that can't really wait. At least the longer we wait, the more complexities in the market, the more difficulties to unwind this as we go forward.
No, and I think people need to understand, everybody says, and they be saying from the beginning, you need to hire more people. it's not that simple, right? The process is that the governor's office, the budget office has to approve a certain number of people for each agency. They have to give you more people. And when they say, like when we started, I think the top number was about 220. John just said that they're about 260, 265. But when they say 220, you don't get 220. You might get 100. And then after a couple of months, they might allow you to hire another 10 people, and that's 10 people across the agency, not just for particular departments. So it's been a massive issue from the very start, and it continues. And separately, I think if we could come up with sort of like the economic impact to the industry from not having these resources, hopefully that could be a sort of motivator for the governor's office to finally give the agency, what they truly need.
I think that last point's a really, really good one, Herb. I mean, I think when you look at the total revenue right now, I think John was talking about the top line revenue figures for the program. What that translates into in terms of tax revenue is amazing. If you look at this year's budget, the lottery, which is where a part of the funds go, got $50 million. Oasis, which is the Office for Addiction Mental Services, got $25 million. The OCM got $25 million, $50 million. Sorry, not the OCM. The OCM got $60 million to run the office, but then there's $50 million that goes into the reinvestment fund. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of tax revenue that are being redeployed to help the state budget. And we know that market penetration isn't where it should be. Meaning, if we need more licenses and we need, better enforcement, those are direct ROIs. If you invest in temporary, again, it could be contracts. Remember when we had a couple of contracts out where we gave third-party consultants, those kind of got caught up in some stuff, but we gave large external consultants the ability to come in for a couple of years. They don't go on the pension system. A lot of what you're describing is the process to hire full-time employees, which of course, like any other business, you got to do carefully. But I think that's the solution. I think you could do an investment up front on that, and your return in terms of tax revenue would so outweigh what you laid out that it's something that's really worth looking at, in my opinion. But
so I knew this was going to be a terrific conversation and the long one. So I'm just going to sort of run through some of the questions that I had and not sort of do a long preamble to them. So if that's okay with you, Axel?
Of course, yeah.
All right, so now we're looking to see, like, if a brand hires a manufacturer to make its products, right, which is happening. So whose product is it legally? Who can distribute it?
Oh, so this is a super issue. This is in the sort of supply chain bucket, the second bucket. I'm glad you're raising this one. This one's got a long history, and unfortunately now, again, one of these situations where the industry's gotten ahead of the regulations. Now we kind of got to put some meat on the bones to decide what we're doing. So the issue you're talking about is in the law itself. It says that if you are a manufacturer of a product, so all the guys girls that have been processing products, you can only distribute your own product. Meaning you can't be a farmer with a brand and then pick up your neighboring farmer's brand that they made on their farm and then put it on your truck and distribute it down. It's not my favorite provision, and it was the subject of a lot of lobbying by certain folks and certain groups back when we were passing this in 2021, and it was a compromise. But effectively, what it does is it reduces competition in the distribution tier, which is a big concern for me. It always has been, because alcohol showed us that distributor is where you have a pinch point. So that's in the law. When it came to the regulations, we did not actually implement that provision, and we did not put any specificity on what it means for it to be your own product. We did not prohibit a large processor manufacturer from white labeling and picking up other brands and distributing. That has never been implemented as a prohibition, which is good. And the market's become really competitive. So you have several companies that are, that I speak to regularly, that are functioning in the distribution tier, that are high logistics company, right? Remember, the distribution tier is a tricky one to play in. You have to have the logistics to distribute across the entire state. You have to collect taxes before you actually get paid by the retailer. So you're providing bridge loans, and you're remitting those taxes to the state, and you're making sure the testing is done properly. So you have a lot of responsibility. So there are a couple of larger companies that are in that space that are doing very well. They're very important. Competing against those companies are these supply side verticals, let's say, that are cultivators, processors, and distributors. Now, there, exactly to your point, I think this is a really good example of sole control, controlling interest, all this kind of stuff. What happens? Well, what happens is the brand approaches, typically California brand or local New York brand, decides it wants to go to market. The market for brands is extremely competitive at retail. So they approach a processor and they say, let's do a branding agreement or a white labeling agreement. And they provide packaging, for example. And they say to the processor, you source the material, you manufacture the products, you go down to the retailer and distribute it. And then whatever you collect, I get a royalty, right? So it's an IP agreement. I get maybe, anywhere from a couple percent to 15% to 20% if you're lucky. And that all depends on what the brand's doing. How active is the brand involved in that process? So in that scenario, to your question exactly, Herb, whose product is it? Mm-hmm. If I have a brand and it's my brand and I own the IP on it, but you are the processor and you're doing all the work, sourcing it, manufacturing it, and it's got your processor number on it, and you're just selling it at distribution, then is it my product or is it your product? That's going to make a tremendous difference. Right now, the market is way ahead on that. It's already made the decision. It's considered that is not my product as the brand, it's your product. But then it gets more complicated. If I'm doing a lot more than that, and I'm buying product from a cultivator, and I'm just doing a tolling agreement with you, right? You're just essentially making my vape, and then I'm taking it again, and I'm in charge of everything. And then, I give it back to you for distribution, or I give it to someone else for distribution, but they're also processing. Is that their product? Is it not their product? And someone's going to sue on this with that law the way it is? And if it's worded the way it is, generally as it is, a court will strike down anybody's ability to distribute. So that has to be resolved, or a large chunk of our current processor distributors are going to be put in a very, very precarious position. So, right. So I think we should be looking at the processor number and the distributor number. And if that's on the RFID tag, that's probably their product. They've materially worked with it and changed it, but that's not what the regs say. The regs don't say anything. And I think now in hindsight, having seen how the market develops, that's a perfect example of something that should be, raised by stakeholders, contemplated, public, comment, and then resolved in the new reg package.
One of the things that OCM and the state constantly say about the benefits of buying legal is that it's been tested. And New York borrowed its testing framework from pharmaceutical standards. But, over the last couple of years, and not just in New York, you've seen a lot of lab testing issues. So how is labs testing causing complications in New York's market today?
Yeah. So you and I have talked about this a lot. Early on, when we were responsible for aggregating all these other states' regulations, and we said, look, what do we not have to reinvent the wheel on, and what do we have to develop differently because the mandate we got from the legislature, nobody's done this, we have to do it. Labs and testing, unfortunately, it was an easy one to borrow, and everybody had been doing that. When you went to these National Cannabis Regulators Association, the earliest ones adopted the regulations for pharmaceutical for the most part, and everybody borrowed it from them. And so you weren't going to be the one state that came out with a different set of regs on lab and testing. It's kind of like that status quo that you couldn't challenge. And then if you remember,
a less rigorous standard, right?
Say again?
You couldn't come out with a less rigorous standard.
No, right? I mean, and then you'd have to explain it in the middle of, again, building the plane while it was up in the air. So that wasn't where we were going to pick a fight. And then you also remember that a big part of pushing for the decriminalization and legalization of cannabis was that it was going to be tested product and it was going to be safe. And that's very, very true. But it was hard to then say we're going to take a softer standard than the one everybody else has adopted and then still argue that point, right? So it was a convergence of these factors that made us really push for this standard. But the truth is, and I think everybody sort of recognizes it, that these are not pharmaceutical products. These are just not that great, and these are not pharmaceutical manufacturers that are manufacturing these cannabis products. And so holding them to that level of rigor is, I think, both creating two things. One is creating costs that are really harming the supply tier and prohibiting people from getting into that business. But second, some of them are so kind of impractical that I think there are externalities and unintended side effects of people lab shopping, labs doing certain things, jimmying results. I think that's in large part a function of these tests and the unreasonableness of it. And that's not what you want, right? As a regulator, if you see that your regulations are unnecessarily aggressive and they're creating all sorts of avoidance of regulation, and you could fine tune them to make them more in line with what's needed, that's also should be sort of a priority. It's a big job. It really is to be the first one out of the gate to say we're going to revamp it. But we do have models, right? There's pharmaceuticals, there's dietary supplements, and there's food. Like we have food that's perishable. We have yogurts, we have drinks, we have all sorts of foods that go through rigorous analysis. It's just the way it's done is different. Like the presumption that you have to get everything tested all the time up front versus taking precautions in how you store and distribute and sell, right? That's how we do it with food, and then less rigorous upfront testing. So it's a fundamental framework shift, which I think people should weigh in on. I know there's like the public health side folks that are like, no, don't touch it. But it's a good one for stakeholders, I think, to contemplate in the context of this stuff.
Now, shifting gear, I know one of the things that we're particularly proud of was the card program. Now, it was originally supposed to be 150 licenses. Then that increased, shortly thereafter to 350, and I'm not even sure what the number is today. So what do you see as the biggest issues facing this group of licensees today?
So this one's a tricky one. It ties into the concepts we've talked about. You and I mean, you know how central the card program was to everything we did at the beginning. We issued Part 116 of the regulations that was really aimed at providing protections for the cards, opportunities for the cards, DASNY funding for the cards. And, we won't revisit that, but one day maybe we'll do a big retrospective, you and I, and we'll talk about the pain we endured in trying to get that fund off the ground. But so here's the reality, right? The card program was ultimately, I think, a success. I think we had 538 in the end. We have almost more than half that are sort of licensed. We have several hundred, I think, the numbers I haven't refreshed recently, but that are open. So we actually have a lot of cards that were able to take advantage of that early licensing
and opened without DASNY. The greater majority opened without DASNY resources.
Some would say despite DASNY, but no. So absolutely. But here's the sort of the real reality on the ground, Herb, and this is kind of why it's got to be talked about, right? I try not to deal with too many cards because it gets so murky so fast. I have card clients, I have clients that have invested in cards, I have clients that lend money to cards. I tend to try to help anybody who's looking to understand the industry and not looking to undermine the key tenets like two-tier market. If someone tells me, oh, how can I get around the two-tier market, I'll say you're talking to the wrong guy. Short of that and other sort of breaches of the system, if there's no regulatory clarity, then I will work with them and I'll try to clean that up. When it comes to the cards, the problem is a lot of the cards, in order to get funding, they've had to circumvent some of the sole control requirements. Exactly like we were talking. Some of the investors that were going to lend were just not going to do it on the basis of purely like no control, no minority rights protections, no say whatsoever, but here's a whole bunch of money. So none of them did that. Not even the DASNY locations, if you look at their operating agreements and their loan documents. So you have a bit of a situation where there's a real kind of the reality on the regs and the reality of what's going on the ground. And there are just too many card licenses for the office to go in and look at them all. And not only that, but there are just too many situations where the cards are actually happy with the deals and they're growing their businesses successfully. So the big question here is, how do you protect now, today, 5 years in, how do you protect the cards so that those that need protection from predatory lenders or whatnot are still retain that protection? But how do you free the cards that are now up and running, who these prohibitions are harming or who are actually in violation of the regs as we speak, but nobody's really talking about it? And so, one of the things to think about or to consider, one of the options to consider, but again, throwing it out there for people to weigh in on, is having the justice-involved individuals themselves decide whether they actually want to keep having this as a protection or if it's constituting a hindrance.
Give them that option, because it's sort of contradictory to say you have sole control and then the agency itself questioning the decision making of that individual.
That's right. Yeah, it's exactly right. It's essentially saying, Herb, you're just as involved. You have to have sole control. You're like, good. I want to now, get more investment because I'm getting my second store and I want to go big. So I'm going to dilute myself from 51 to 40 by getting a new investor involved. And then I say, well, no, Herb, hang on a second. You can't do that. That's too much. You're giving up your sole control.
We're gonna protect you against yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, I'm good with it. That's my sole control. I want to do this. And you're like, but you can't. So it's an impossible situation. Look, again, not something we had anticipated necessarily. We knew it was going to be, we didn't know where to draw the line. Remember the early discussion on sole control, how far to allow that dilution. But it's good. It's a good problem to have, Herb, right? I mean, it means there are a bunch of successful businesses out there. And for the most part, people are happy because they were early licenses, they got investment, and they're either turning them around or they're diluting or someone's coming in to help them and they're growing and they're making way more money than they thought they would. So I think what you need, and I've talked to people about this, and I think there's a general sense that this could be a solution. It doesn't solve the entire card program, but for those that you'd want to make sure that they understand what their protections are. So restate the law and say, look, you get to keep 51% of your profit, 51% of your equity. You can't sell for 4 years. These are all protections you currently have. But if you attest and if you say, I want to step out of that framework, I want this to be a regular license, the board could do that because we made the card program out of Part 116. Mm-hmm. So you could just do that, give people the ability to submit that, free those folks, narrow the pool of cards that are seeking protection significantly, and then those are the ones that, that if there are any complaints, the OCM can say, well, let me review your deal documents. Let me see what you're doing to see if there's a loss of sole control or if this loan is predatory. I don't know. That's a suggestion people are kicking around. Mm-hmm. But it is a little problematic to have rules on the books and, a very different reality on the ground.
All right, Axel, I have a few more questions. So finding a suitable location, especially in New York City, but elsewhere, is a challenge. What have you seen related to the issues of leases and proximity protection, which was really a huge issue, if I remember correctly, last summer?
It was. Well, look, rolling out the proximity protections was a lot more complicated than I thought, but I still am a huge fan of proximity protection. I think if done objectively and transparently, it provides a bit of a buffer to all these businesses, but not only from a sort of allow people to give them a chance to sort of grow, but also from a public health standpoint, which was the original impetus, really was. We were afraid we would have cannabis dense zones. So you'd have a street with all the cannabis stores lined up. That's how businesses often work, right? The analogy we were always talking about back in the day was what happened when you go to a fast food, Burger King on one corner, McDonald's on the other corner, and another fast food joint on the same exact corner, because people come in and that's where they go to get their product. And that drives down prices. We didn't want to have the lowest possible prices for public health reasons. We wanted these to be community grounded, community centered. So there should be a good proximity protection implementation. It was rocky. There's a lot of reasons for that. We could go into, again, politics, personalities, board members. You'll remember all that.
Yeah, and actually, when I mentioned tied houses at the beginning with brewers owning the saloons and the bars, it is one of the reasons that gave rise to alcohol prohibition. There was just bars and saloons on every corner. Yeah. And it was one of the things that prompted alcohol prohibition.
I'd forgotten that one, Herb. I mean, I know it was mandatory reading for everyone. I was going to pull out my book, towards alcohol regulation back in the 30s. But you're right. You're right. It was the proliferation and the sheer number of bars. Like you just couldn't, one after another, and you just don't want that. You don't want that. So I'm a big fan of proximity protection. I think it'll take some time for those rules to get cemented, for the board to have a sort of precedent system where they're like, well, we tend to do it on these. The new regs were great, I think, in trying to provide a bit of certainty. But here's the thing on that. I think that, again, resource issue, but it's the number of what I call kind of like dead or, fake leases, frankly. You have two things that converged. One is you have unscrupulous players that are locking up areas. I think that's the minority. So you have people that are like, I want to go here, but I don't have a location yet, so I'm going to get my buddy to give me a lease, and that'll lock up that space. And it's a fake lease, and it might even be entirely fictitious. But of course, there are thousands of these, and the office doesn't have the bandwidth to investigate every single one of these and track down the landlord and make sure it's the real landlord and call them and all that. Who's going to do that, right? So that's the minority. But I think one of the administrative and systemic things that weren't anticipated, but that also resulted in more of these leases, is the whole provisional licensing system. So you'll recall, if you don't have a final license, you have a provisional. That provisional gives you 12 months. And it says, hey, you got 12 months to find a spot. Well, 12 months can be, short or long if you're trying to find investors and whatnot. And that actually expires at the end of the year, which is another reason, as an aside, that cards, you should be able to freeze some of these cards, because a lot of them are not going to make that. And you're going to have a cliff where they all lose their card license. So these provisionals, one of the strategies, which is, again, not illegal, and you would expect smart people to sort of find workarounds to administrative burdens and delays or uncertainty. What they do is they get a lease that they could use but don't really intend to use, and they submit it, and then they get issued a final license. So now it's no longer a provisional, it becomes a final license, which means it's good. You have the extra protection of it being a final license, and they can't revoke it, constitutional protections. And now you don't have that clock hanging over your head. So it's a lot easier if you have a provisional to just go ahead, get that final license, even if you're not thinking about opening it for a while. And so what you do is you go to a store, maybe it's a corner store, deli or whatever, and you know someone there, and you say, look, I'm thinking of opening a dispensary here. This is all legit. And the deli says, look, if you're ready to go, I'll move out and I'll sublease to you. Here's a sublease when you're good and ready. Right. And that's not illegal. You're genuinely considering opening there, but there's no timeline. You're not going to do it in any hurry, and you don't have to do it with any hurry. And so what it puts on the books is a lot of these sort of placeholder or dead leases, and it ties up space. And I've heard this just all the time, right? People call and they say, I know this location is not really going to be open, and again, the office doesn't have the bandwidth. So this goes back to the idea of, can we get a third party? Can we give a third party a contract, a bunch of accountants with some real estate experience, put together some parameters where the landlord has to show and attest it's a genuine lease, it's actually going to be implemented in the next X number of years, or if not, you keep your license, but you got to go somewhere else, right? And if the clock's ticking, if you're not going to open in 2 years, and that's what we all want to do, that they expire, because we also were concerned about licenses staying unused for years, but that's a different thing. Don't force people to get a location to keep their license, because that's just creating this perverse incentive.
Right. No, and I've heard some horror stories around that as well.
Yeah, you've seen it. I mean, everybody's heard it on the ground, right? But again, you need specialty folks that can just a contract with 25 people dedicated to that for 12 months to get a process in place. I don't know. Again, I speak from a position of both you and I have the privilege of not having to deal with all the fires that the office has to deal with all the time. So it's easier said than done by far.
So now, as the market continues to mature, it's inevitable that some businesses are going to fail, right? And that's normal. That's not a failure of the market. So how is this a particular issue for cannabis businesses?
Yes. So I think we talked about this early on, because you had a question where someone was saying, I think it was, I'm kind of folding up, right? I'm wrapping up. I'm going to go into another business. I can't make it. I can't sustain the rent roll. There's too many competitors now next to me. What's the process? And we were talking about it. And remember, there's no federal bankruptcy. And so normally in a situation like this,
there is federal bankruptcy, but cannabis businesses can't access that.
Exactly. Thank you. Exactly. Yeah. All these rules exist, and they exist for a very good reason for businesses to take advantage of them to create orderly unwindings, but they don't exist for cannabis because it's still federally illegal, just like banking and lending, which is why we have these tortured rules about, investors and sole control and that. So in this particular case, because bankruptcy is not available to these businesses, either individuals that want to unwind or creditors that want to unwind or partners that are dissolving. I mean, there are partners that just are at each other's throats. They were best friends, and now they're mortal enemies, as happens in partnership disputes, and we're dealing with several of those at our firm. You have to sort of structure and unwind and say, all right, guys, what are the assets? What are your liabilities? How do we unpack this? What do you each get? Let's find a structured way to do this. You can go to a court and propose something and get a court-appointed receiver, which is actually really positive. And I think people are starting to talk about how to take advantage of that. The thing we did, though, which I think is super important, just like in the alcohol beverage control law, we set up a section of the law and the regulations on receivership. So you can't just go privately to a judge and get someone appointed without the office knowing and weighing in, and just sort of like change hands, unwind the license, give the license to someone else, transfer this asset, take the inventory, right? Those are all no-nos. I mean, this is a highly regulated space. That has to be done under the supervision of the office. And so we put these general provisions in, we pulled them in from the alcohol beverage control law, we stuck them in the regs, and we haven't thought about them since, because we were in stand-up mode and growth mode. But now, 2,000 plus licenses, 5 years in or 3 years of open market, you have some folks that are exiting. It's just totally normal. So this is kind of the cresting wave, I call it, that's about to hit. And there needs to be some guidance on how you can apply to the office with a receiver, some order, right? We used it a couple of times in the office back in the day, but it was when a card died and we needed to transfer it over. So there's a precedent, but it was in a very specific situation. Here, the office may be required to review the agreement, right, between these two partners and say, okay, what's fair is one taking advantage of the other. That's going to be really difficult. So trying to get your head around it now, or having people, the stakeholders, recommend things, people that are experts in this, lawyers, how you can have a structured unwinding and what the role of the office is going to be in approving independent receivers. I think that's something that is worth getting ahead of with some regulatory clarity. That's a big one too.
Now, one of the reasons that we have a new acting executive director at the office is because, at least reported, there was an administrative case that the agency was bringing that sort of fell apart at the last minute. So, when the agency takes, action against a licensee, how does that process work? How is it supposed to work? And what's the authority that the administrative law judges actually have at OCM?
Well, this is a difficult one. It's difficult because it's one of those areas in the regulations where we had to reinvent the entire enforcement section, because there was nothing. What were we going to hang our hat on, right? We borrowed from the Department of Health because they supervise certain regulated entities. We borrowed from the State Liquor Authority because they have, state liquor enforcement agents that go in to make sure no underage and whatnot. But it's Section 133. It's a very comprehensive section. I remember working on that. There are a couple of attorneys that are my firm, Patricia here among them, that worked, absolutely centrally on this, developing a whole new process. So imagine that. Like, when can you go in and inspect? What are the consequences? What's a notice of petition? What's a notice of violation? How can you shut down? What kind of sanctions? What do the administrative law judges get to hear? And so I think there's a couple of questions here that people, this is really technical, and I think it's more maybe on the lawyers' side. There's the New York State Bar Association, for example. That's a good resource there. But the administrative law judge framework that we'd set up was originally intended more for the illegal shops, the trap stores, and shutting those down, and because they would need a right of appeal. There is room to have the administrative law judges review some of these licensed sanctions and actions. So if someone comes in and inspects you and you're a retailer and you're found not to be carding someone and they give you a fine and you appeal that fine, it goes to the ALJ, the administrative law judge. But what that means is that there's going to be a lot more cases as enforcement ramps up that goes through the administrative law judge process, which means that the office needs to be given the resources. They need a team. They need a team of prosecutors, essentially, within that office, or they need to involve the Attorney General's office. So I used to work and supervise, the Department of Health. That was when I was with Cuomo, that was my bailiwick. We had a group at the Attorney General's office that was dedicated, called Mufuku, that was dedicated to prosecuting violations of the health rules, Medicaid in particular, because they were so many and they were so specific and so specialized that we would have had to have a whole team of prosecutors in the Department of Health. That's what the office needs. So either that or give it the AG some more funding. You remember we had talked about that even back in the day, but you really need to give them the resources to do it right, because it is a very technical process with appeal rights, with a lot of like briefing and with hearings, and you can't do it willy-nilly. You just can't do it on a shoestring budget. And that's sort of what we've seen. And that's kind of how you make mistakes and you set bad precedent. And bad precedent then feeds on itself, and then everybody starts following that bad precedent, and you get outcomes of regulations that you never intended. You know what I mean? Like, we're at the beginning there. That's why I thought it could be a topic of discussion, but this one's really technical, so I don't want to weigh in too deeply, because the experts really need to weigh in on how the ALJ process works.
All right, Axel, I think we need to wrap it up here. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we conclude, something that we haven't discussed today?
Well, I mean, maybe just in terms of a big picture about what why we're having this conversation, Herb, and why I think it's important. And the mission stays. John knows, everybody who's there knows that what we wanted to do differently at OCM was enlist stakeholder participation in this process, right? From the beginning, we went out to every community to tell them about the licensing opportunity. We gave folks from disproportionately impacted areas access to those licenses. We went out with our board meetings and our listening sessions. It's in the DNA of the office. I think it's one of the most special things that we were able to do, to have that kind of government outreach. I think it's wonderful that the office is doing that again. And it's important, because the way the reg process works, as you know, is you have to take input even before you go out for public comment. Because once you go out for public comment, it means you've vetted it through legal, you've vetted it through the leadership. So, John and his team are going to look at these proposals, say yes, no, then go to legal. Legal has to draft them, add them to the spreadsheet we had, the master reg chart that now is 5 years old. That reg chart has got to be pretty big right now. All that has to go through. Then you finally issue the regs and you put them out for public, say, look, I think we got this. Here's public comment. Please provide us public comment. That's more of a fine-tuning exercise. If you try to get in there and you have a wholesale revamping of something, it's going to be hard for the office to go back to the drawing table, go back through the executive approval and the council approval to reissue those regs. So really what they're doing is really laudable, which is saying, hey, you have some thoughts, you have some ideas, the market, and the governor's done this as a priority in the state of her state. Can we trim and cut and prune regulations that are getting in the way of New York businesses being successful, especially small businesses, especially equity businesses. So now's the time for folks to think of the issues. That's why we're having this convo. That's why I'm kind of coming out a little bit out of retirement and saying, let's consider these things. Now, try to come in with specific suggestions. That's the other thing I would recommend doing, is try to draft them in a way that's succinct, point to the right regs, maybe propose some language. There are a few lawyers, as you know, in the office. So the more help you can give them with specific language on how you think it would help and explain why that language helps, the time is now, so they can consider it as they put those regs out for public comment. So that's it. The process is a little tortured, but we really would love to just keep stakeholders engaged. It's wonderful, and we need that fine tuning of the engine. But I think it's running well. It sounds nice. It's a purring engine, and it's a big, fast engine. So exciting to be in this car.
All right. Well, thank you for your time today. Axel Bernabe, former Chief of Staff and Senior Policy Director at OCM, and now a partner at the Hodgson Russ Law Firm. Thank you, Axel.
Thank you, Herb. That's very formal, but it's really just you and me chatting in public about all the things we need to tweak. And it's always been a privilege to work with you on this, and I'm glad you're still involved, and we get to sort of reminisce like this and do some things that hopefully create some good.
Now we go out and get some Negronis.
Amen to that.